I said tonight that what I want to focus on is Ishmael's Islamic invasion. That's the title of the message, and it has three parts: Ishmael, Islam, and the invasion that is going to be a part of that coalition of nations that come together under the flag of Islamic faith to try to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. I thought it might be beneficial if at first I were to give you some vocabulary words. You may hear reports about Islam. You may not understand why they use this term or that term and what are they really talking about. For example, the word Islam and the word Muslim. Are they the same? Are they synonymous? Well, what does it mean? Well, Islam is the religiosity. A Muslim is one who is a participant in Islam. Like we are Christians. We are participants in Christianity. So if you hear the word Islam, then you know that's the religiosity. Muslim is a person who is under that type of faith. You also hear then about Arabs, and you maybe don't have an understanding of Arabs. There are 23 Arab nations in our world. Now that's not all of the Islamic nations. An Arab nation, and it's a misnomer, but the media has perverted it. An Arab nation would be a nation who speaks Arabic, the language of Arabic, that's their mother tongue, but in addition to that, they are of the Islamic faith. I told you there were 23 different Arab nations. Now there are additional nations that do not speak Arabic, but they're of the Islamic faith as well. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Indonesia. There's over 300 million people living in India of the Islamic faith. If you just took the population of Islam in India, it would be the largest country in the Islamic world. And so you understand that there are Arab nations and Islamic nations. When you look at the Islamic religiosity itself, it has two factions. There are the Sunnis, S-U-N-N-I-S, and the Shiites, S-H-I-T-E-S. The reason that they broke into these two factions was soon after the death of Muhammad. They were trying to select the next leader to lead Islam into the future, and there was a big debate going on between the two. One group believes that it had to be a descendant of Muhammad. The other believed that it just had to be a spiritual Islamic person to take over the leadership. Doesn't matter which is which, but that's how the Islamic world is divided. 85% of the Islamic world is of the Sunni persuasion. 15% is of the Shiite persuasion. The largest Shiite nation in the world is Iran, and it is an Islamic republic, which means their government is dictated to by the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam. That's a Shiite nation. Hezbollah, their surrogate terrorist organization in southern Lebanon, they are of the Shiite persuasion. They have some people in Yemen who are of the Shiite persuasion, the Houthis, and they are a part of trying to bring Yemen down and get the Iranian element and control into there. Some 60% of the population of Iraq is Shiite. You have the nation of Iraq divided into three parts. In the north, it's the Kurds. In the center part of the state, it's the Sunnis. And in the south, it's Shiites. 60% of the population of Iraq is Shiite. That middle portion, 20%, it is Sunni, and the top portion of that third would be the Kurds, which are only 20% of the population of Iraq. This helps you to better understand, I believe, when you get that concept in your mind, why there is sectarian battles going on, for example, in Iraq. The only good thing I can say about Saddam Hussein was he kept the sectarian battles from continuing on. The Shiites hate the Sunnis, and the Sunnis hate the Shiites. Saudi Arabia is a Sunni nation. You do know, do you not, that the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia are trying to destroy the Shiites in Iran, and they're at each other. And this sectarian battles that are going on in the Middle East is, well, everybody who's not a Muslim is standing by and just applauding as they continue on to destroy and kill each other, and especially the Jewish nation of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu says, keep it on, fellas. We're excited about that. You're not messing with us when you're messing with each other. So that gives you some of the information, some of the glossary, or the vocabulary words that when you hear those words, will give you an idea of what's talking about. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to look at Ishmael first, but I want to look at what leads up to Ishmael. Take your Bibles and let's go to the book of Genesis. And what I'm going to do in about the first 16 chapters, I'm going to lay out what that chapter in Genesis is all about and why it's key for your study. Absolutely, without reservation, I would have to tell you the first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis are key to your understanding of doctrine. All doctrine that is in the Word of God is gleaned from the study there in the book of Genesis chapters 1 to 12. The foundation for Bible prophecy is also found in those 12 chapters, chapters 1 to 12 in the book of Genesis. If you want to understand and see what's going to happen ultimately in the future and see where its beginning was, you go back to the book of beginnings. That's the book of Genesis. For example, in chapter 1, we see the record of creation. I don't call it the story of creation, because if I designate it as a story, that almost gives the indication, I believe it could be a fairy tale, a bedtime story, or something that's not true. I believe this is absolute truth. It's a literal truth that is absolute. It was a 6-day, 24-hour day time period, 6 of those days, when Jesus Christ, Colossians 1:16, created the heavens, the earth, and all that in them is. Now, one of the reasons I say it's a 24-hour day, because when you come to the book of Exodus, chapter 20 and verse 11, in the 10 Commandments, there's this statement from verse 11. He said, in 6 days I created the heavens and the earth and all that in them is, and now I want you to rest the 7th day. He wasn't talking to the Jewish people to observe the Sabbath for 1 billion years. He was observing the Sabbath for 1 day. And thus, 6 days of creation, the day of rest, the Sabbath. That's what he was giving to the Jewish people in the 10 Commandments. In addition to that, when you look up the word Yom, Y-O-M, in the Hebrew language, it means day. And every single time, get a Strong's Concordance, check me out, every single time the word Yom is used and it has a numerical adjective with it, it is referring to a 24-hour day. The Jewish people get their 24-hour day from the night and the day, the night and the day. It continually says that 6 times in chapter 1. And so we see in chapter 1 creation. Chapter 2 would be the special details, the effects of creation, and that's where we came from when we were studying the location of the Garden of Eden. So it tells us that in chapter 2 as well. Chapter 3 is the fall of man, sometime between chapter 1 verse 31, where the Lord said through the prophet Moses, who wrote the book of Genesis, inspired of the Holy Spirit of God, he concluded 6 days of creation, and then he said, everything is very good. That's chapter 1, verse 31. I like the Hebrew flavor with it. Instead of saying everything is very good, he said everything is abundantly excellent. And that means that angels, which were created in the 6 days of creation, angels were created all good. There were no evil angels in the first 6 days of creation. There's no such thing as prehistoric creative activities. Prehistoric is an oxymoron, which means absolutely nothing. So don't use that term. There's nothing prehistoric. In the beginning. I don't know how simple that is. It's very simple, isn't it? Those are the first words in the Old Testament, the first words in the Bible. But sometime between chapter 1, verse 31 and chapter 3, verse 1, Lucifer, who was created the most prominent of all creatures, according to Ezekiel chapter 28, was put in the position of prominence by Jesus himself, the Creator, then rebelled against the Lord, and about 1/3 of all created angels rebelled, and he was thrown out of the 3rd heaven and down to the 1st heaven. There's 3 heavens, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and down to the 1st heaven, and there he's been operating for about 6,000 years. And one of the first acts was to cause Adam and Eve to sin. That's chapter 3. Chapter 4 is the story of Cain and Abel. Cain, of course, was the firstborn, Abel the secondborn. They both are at the Garden of Eden. Now you might remember I was telling you the Garden of Eden in our study on Sunday night was the location of the Temple Mount of the city of Jerusalem. That's where Adam and Eve were. That's where they were created, that foundation stone underneath that gold dome building at the Dome of the Rock there in the Temple Mount area. And that was the location where Cain and Abel would bring their offering. And both thought they were doing the very best thing they could do. Well, Cain was not doing very well. He was bragging about what he did because he just brought vegetables, the products of his crops that he had grown. Abel slaughtered an animal, and without the shedding of blood, of course, there's no remission of sin. So we see that foundational truth laid out there. And so it upset Cain so bad that he killed, in the first murders in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis as well, Cain killed his brother Abel. They had another brother. Now, they had many more brothers and sisters. We only read about 3 of them here in the text. But at the end of chapter 4, which is the story of Cain and Abel, we see Seth, another brother, comes, and he is a man of God, a preacher, according to the book of Hebrews chapter 11, in the hall of fame for those of people of faith. He was a preacher of the gospel, and it says there in the last verse, and to Seth, to him also there was born a son. He called his name Enos, and then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. You call upon the Lord when you've heard somebody give that message. How can they call unless they hear? How can they hear unless someone goes? That's chapter 4. Chapter 5 is the genealogy. Please do me a favor and do yourself a favor. Don't skip over genealogies. When you're studying the Word of God, there's powerful information in genealogy. Let me show you just an example of that. I want you to notice here in verse 23. And all the days of Enoch. Now, he was a son of Methuselah. Methuselah was Enoch's son. I was trying to get that right. All the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him up. What happened was Enoch was such a godly man that he walked on the earth, and then he walked right into heaven. Enoch, I believe, is one of those 2 witnesses because he's never died. Hebrews 9:27, appointed unto man once to die. But that's something you glean information from going through so-and-so begot so-and-so begot so-and-so. Another interesting thing was that from creation all the way over to Abraham is 1948 years. Did you get that? Isn't that interesting? From creation to Abraham is 1948 years. 1948 when the Jewish people became a nation in modern times. I don't think that necessarily has anything to do with it, but I thought it was a very interesting coincidence. By the way, from creation to the flood is 1656 years. Now, how do I get that? I add up the numbers. It's real simple. This is God's Word. I don't believe there are any spaces in years. God's Word, it's authority. It has to be correct. 1656 years from creation until the flood, and then Abraham was born 2 years after the flood, so that gives us another 292 years before he's born. And so we get the 1948. And so you get this from a genealogy. Notice something else here. From Adam, the first one mentioned, to Noah. And there's something that's going to happen in chapter 6, 7, and 8. I don't know where Pastor stands on this. We may have a little bit of a dispute over here, but I believe chapter 6, 7, and 8 is the record of angels committing sexual intercourse with human women. I don't know how they could commit fornication over in the book of Jude without it happening sometime, and this is the place where I see it happen. Having said that, it's key to understand chapter 5 because there's no evil angelic bloodline mentioned here in the genealogy in chapter 5. Go over here to chapter 6 in a moment, verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was just man and perfect in his generation, and Noah walked with God. Now wait a minute. He wasn't perfect in the fact that he had never sinned. All of us have sinned and come short of the glory of God. He was perfect because he didn't have any evil angelic bloodline. How do we know that? The genealogy. That's why I'm saying don't skip genealogies. And I want to show you one more thing, and then I'll get away from the genealogy. Do you understand from creation until the time of Methuselah, it's going to be less than 2,000 years. It's going to be 1,656 years to the flood. Do you know how long Adam lived? 950 years. 950 years. 930. Look at verse 5. In all the days of Adam, it lived 930 years, and he died. You know how many years Methuselah lived? 969 years. Do you know that overlaps? Do you understand that Methuselah had an opportunity to talk with Adam, the man who was created? Wow. They spent time having conversation together. I think that's dynamite. And do you know who Noah's granddaddy was? Methuselah. Do you know what granddaddies love to do? Tell their grandsons stories. Don't you imagine that Methuselah told Noah about Adam? My granddaddy used to tell me stories. My granddaddy was born and raised in Opelika, Alabama. And when he was about 10 years old, his mama would give him a nickel. He could go into this general store, spend it any way he wanted to on Saturday morning. That nickel, he could get a lot for a nickel back then. He got there one Saturday morning. There was a commotion outside. He went to the window, looked out, and across the street at the bank was Jesse James' bank robber gang. And he watched Jesse James and his gang rob the bank there in Opelika, Alabama. And when I was a little boy and about 4 years old, when I could understand it, my granddaddy told me that story. He told me that story until I was in my early 20s when he died. And every year it got better and better. But and my granddaddies loved to tell their stories. Don't you think it was neat that Methuselah had a relationship with Adam and then he gave that to Noah? And by the way, Noah lived after Abraham was born. He lived about 70 years over there where Abraham was born. Where did Noah live? Noah lived where his great-grandson built that great city called Babel or Babylon. And guess who lived down the road there? In Ur of the Chaldees, Abraham. They would spend, man, if I had a connection all the way back to Adam, don't you think I'd be talking with somebody about it? Well, I just give you that information. That's what you get from a genealogy, so it's a great study. Chapter 6, 7, and 8 is Noah and the flood, and all the details that you'll need to ever know about the flood. Chapter 9 is Noah after the flood. Look at chapter 9 and verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, or repeople the earth. There were only 8 souls left after the flood that inundated the entire world, 15 feet higher than the highest mountain at that time in history. And so in chapter 9, we see what God's plan for the future is for Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives to be fruitful, multiply, and repeople the earth. But you know what else happened in chapter 9? The institution of human government. Look at verse 6. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. That is what we call capital punishment today, and within the framework of capital punishment, it's the highest responsibility of human government. This is the establishment of the institution of human government. Look here at verse 13. What else happens in chapter 9? I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token or a covenant between me and the earth. That's the establishment of the rainbow. The Lord gives us the rainbow for the purpose of knowing He's never going to judge the earth again with water. Next time it's going to be by fire. But it's a token from God. Every time I see a rainbow, I get so excited. If I see a double rainbow, I go Pentecostal. I mean, it's unbelievable what to think that God has done. He gives us a communication simply with a beautiful rainbow in the sky. That's chapter 9. Chapter 10 is another genealogy and how the boys go and start nations. The beginning of all nations were established in chapter 10 after the flood. Look here in verse 32 of chapter 10. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. That's where nations come into existence 4,500 years ago after the flood. Chapter 11 is the story of Tower of Babel, and you might remember that Nimrod went against what God said to do and tried to repeople the earth, but instead he built one great city. Chapter 11 verse 4. And they say, go to and let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. In that one verse, you see chapters 17 and 18 of the book of Revelation. Chapter 17, it's the establishment of a false religiosity headquartered in Rome, Italy. Here, that mother-son cult that'll be operative in Rome, Italy, was established some 4,500 years ago. And so here's Nimrod establishing a false religion. That's why I said, let's build us a tower whose top may reach into heaven. Last place he wanted to go was heaven because he was going against God. But notice he also said, let us build us a city. I believe that's the city of Babylon, which has not been destroyed. Isaiah 13:14, Jeremiah 15:51, Revelation chapter 16, Revelation chapter 18. It says In Revelation 18, verses 10, 17, and 19, in 1 hour, Babylon will be destroyed. In 1 hour. And then Jesus steps back on the earth. That has not happened. Babylon has never been destroyed. That's chapter 11, and the foundation it lays. Chapter 12 is the beginning of the Abrahamic covenant when God calls Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees. Chapter 13, his journey is completed. He goes now into the land of promise. Remember, he brought his nephew Lot along with him. And notice, I want you to notice something, that what he did for Lot. When they got into the land, they had a little commotion between their servants, the people who were working with them. And so Abraham started to give Lot a piece of real estate that God had given to him. Look what it says in verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he beheld the plain of Jordan, that's the Jordan Valley there at Jericho, that before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, the garden of the Lord. He stood there, and he was selecting a piece of real estate. He looked up and down the Jordan Valley. He said, this looks like the Garden of Eden. Well, hello, it was. Because the Garden of Eden was the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, less than 21 miles away, down to where Lot was standing. It looks still like the Garden of Eden. But let me show you where Abraham went to live. Go to the last verse here, verse 18. Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. Why did God send old Abraham over to Hebron? He wanted him to learn all the truths that all the other great saints had had. He wanted him to be at the entrance to the Garden of Eden, and that is the entrance. According to Orthodox Judaism, Hebron is the entrance to the Garden of Eden. By the way, in the 23rd chapter of the book of Genesis, that's where Abraham purchased a location to bury his wife, and then he was buried there, and then Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried there, and then Jacob and Leah were buried there. That's the cave burial site of the patriarchs there at Hebron. And he paid cash money, by the way, for that piece of real estate. In chapter 14, we come to the study on Melchizedek. Now, somebody told me when I got here on Sunday morning, they asked me, who do I think Melchizedek was? And I said, well, who does the pastor think? You see, when I come into a church, I'm wanting to conform with the pastor. I put myself under the leadership of the church leadership and the pastor in particular. So I don't want to go after the pastor. I think that is very stupid to try to do something like that. I would never do it. So I want to say, well, who does he think Melchizedek is? And he says what he thinks is Jesus Christ. Right on! That sounds good to me. A pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ, Melchizedek, right here in chapter 14. Never had a father, never had a mother, never had a beginning, does not have an ending. He was a king. He was also a priest, a high priest. It's just a wonderful understanding of who Christ is. And it's indeed a mention of, he was in Salem, and you go back in the scriptures and look it up, 76th chapter of Psalm, verse 2 says, Salem is Jerusalem. When you come to the 15th chapter, the continuation and basically the conclusion of the Abrahamic covenant. And this is a wonderful passage of scripture. You ought to deal with this. This is the first of the 4 unconditional covenants that God gives the Jewish people, and a promise that they would be a nation forever, number one, and they would have a piece of real estate forever. Do you know you're not a nation if you don't have a piece of real estate? You can be a people, you can even put a government together, but if you don't have a piece of real estate, you're not a nation. And so God is going to promise the Jewish people a piece of real estate. Notice here in verse 18, and in the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Now I'm going to stop right there, but that gives me a launch pad because there are 38 passages in the scriptures that deal with the biblical borders of Israel. And let me just tell you what they are, if I've not mentioned it to you. It starts in Egypt, and we understand that. I believe that's the Nile River. Some say it's the Wadi in Egypt. Who's going to argue about a few pieces of real estate between them? It doesn't matter. It's a river in Egypt. And then it goes north along the Mediterranean coast, takes in the Sinai, takes in all of Israel, takes in all of Lebanon. At the northern end of Lebanon, the Euphrates River comes out of Turkey, coming down, making a southeastern turn, which takes in then all of Syria, takes in all of Jordan, 3/4 of Iraq, all of Kuwait, and 3/4 of Saudi Arabia. Did you hear what I just said? God has promised 10 times what he has given the Jewish people today to give them for the future in the millennial kingdom after his return. Half of Egypt, all of Israel, all of Lebanon, all of Jordan, all of Syria, 3/4 of Iraq, all of Kuwait, 3/4 of Saudi Arabia. That's all the land that God's promised the Jewish people. The late Hafez al-Assad, who was the father of the present president of Syria, Bashar Assad, he was the president then. One day he made a statement like this. He said, the problem in the Middle East is that these Jews believe the Bible. They believe that God's given them all this land. I said, right on, Hafez al-Assad, that's correct. And they believe God's going to give it to them, and he is going to give them to them. It's a part of the Abrahamic and the land covenant. Now we come to chapter 16. I've given you about a 2,000-year history in less than about 7 minutes. Now, you can release a little bit on your seatbelt. I know we've been traveling pretty quickly, but you need to have that understanding. I could stand here, I'm not bragging about this, I could give you almost all the chapters in the book of Genesis. How are you going to study God's word unless you have the foundation? If you're going to study Bible prophecy, you got to have the foundation. If you're going to study biblical doctrine, you got to have the foundation. Genesis, the book of beginnings, is a key book for your study. When we come to chapter 16, here's where we're going to bring in our subject now, Ishmael, and then we'll get to Islam and then the Islamic invasion. Chapter 16, at this point in time, Abraham and Sarah have no children. Now, verse 1 of chapter 16, Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaiden, the Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. In other words, she could not have any children. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abraham hearkened unto the voice of Sarah, and went in and impregnated Hagar. Now, this is not God's plan, to have him commit adultery with another woman. That's not his plan. But he was a sinner just like you and myself. And so he is going to have to pay the consequences for that later down the line. But this is out of God's perfect will. In chapter 2 of Genesis, which I did not look at, that's where he brought the institution of marriage together. One man, one woman, leaving their mothers and fathers and cleaving to each other. That's God's plan, not what we see Abraham doing here with Hagar. But that's what happened. We report. I like it. You know what God's word does? It shows all the warts. You can't put makeup over the warts in the Old Testament or the New Testament. All the warts of the people of God. It comforts me a little bit because they weren't perfect and I'm not perfect. So I got the grace that God gives, and that's all what we need. But Ishmael is going to be born here. Now I want to show you a couple of things. This is the firstborn of Abraham. The secondborn is going to get the promise. The son of promise is going to be Isaac. He'll be born in a couple of chapters. But the firstborn is Ishmael. Again, the angel of the Lord is going to appear unto the mother of Ishmael, Hagar. And the angel of the Lord, I would submit to you again, is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. Look here in verse 7. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by a fountain in the way to Shur. Now notice what he says to her, verse 10. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly. There's no angel that does that. That has to be Jesus. I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for a multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thine affliction. Now notice the character reference that Jesus Christ gives to Ishmael. And he shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all of his brethren. That's the character reference that Jesus gives about Ishmael. A wild man. And like a wild donkey, it's been translated sometimes. His hand against every man, every man's hand against him, fighting continually. Well, I want you to know something. Ishmael, many people teach, was the father of the Arab world. Now, I'm going to show you that is not correct. I want to show you what the word says. Jesus was the one who was meeting here with Hagar. Hagar. Where was she from? Somebody speak it out. Egypt? That's the largest Arab world in the world. Wow, 88 million people there. Is there a medical doctor in the building? Please raise your hand if you're a medical. Thank you, sir. Would you give me testimony, please, sir? Is it possible for a son to birth his mother? Not in your experience. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your experience. Hello? Ishmael didn't father the Egyptians. His mother was from Egypt. Now, how simple is that? When you read the text, think of what you're reading. Go over here to chapter 17 and verse 20. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he begot, and I will make him a great nation. He's going to make Ishmael a great nation. Now, I'll show you which one it is in just a moment. But keep your finger here and go back with me, if you will, over here to Genesis chapter 10. Remember Genesis chapter 10? I told you that was the beginning of nations. When the Lord told Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth to be fruitful, multiply, they were to fill the earth and establish nations. Now let's look here, chapter 10, and I want you to look at verse 6. And the sons of Ham, Seth, Ham, and Shem. And the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put. Do you get it? Cush, Hebrew word for Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan. Mizraim, Hebrew word for Egypt. Put, Hebrew word for Libya. Okay, those are all Arab nations. Remember I said after the flood, Abraham was born 292 years? Sir Doctor, let me ask you again. Can a man who's not going to be born for 292 years before he's born birth children? Be very difficult. Thank you very much. He's covering his bases. He's a diplomat, is he not? But I want to tell you something. It's impossible. These are Arab nations. And notice here what it says. Cush, down here, had Nimrod. Now look at verse 10. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel in the land of Shinar. That's modern day Iraq. That's another Arab nation. Now notice what it says here when you keep reading to verse 20. These are the sons of Ham after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, in their nations. These were Arab nations. They weren't called Arab at that point in time, but Arab nations before Abraham ever came on the scene, before Ishmael ever came on the scene. Chapter 17, verse 20 said Ishmael had one nation that he would father. Go to chapter 25 of the book of Genesis. Remember I told you we were looking yesterday at Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Esau, but I also said this is a genealogy basically for Ishmael as well. Verse 12 of chapter 25. Now these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian, Sarah's handmaiden, bare unto Abraham. Now look at verse 18. He talks about the 12 sons he has. He talks about what they're going to do, and I'll describe them in a moment. But in verse 18, you know where they went to live? Right here in verse 18. And they dwelt from Havilah unto Shur, that is before Egypt, as thou goest towards Assyria. And he died in the presence of all of his brethren. That's a geographical description of what we know as Arabia or Saudi Arabia today. That's the only nation that Ishmael ever fathered, Arabia. He went there and fathered a nation. Why are those nations called Arab countries? Because there's Arabs who live in Arabia. The word Arab in Arabic means Bedouin or nomad. Now think, who is it that lives in Saudi Arabia? Bedouins and nomads. Normally, until you find this black stuff coming up out of the ground in Saudi Arabia, all you had to do was sustain your life on selling or slaughtering and selling the meat from your sheep and your goats. And so you put up a Bedouin tent, you traveled throughout the desert, moving from one green pasture to another green pasture, and there are green pastures in the deserts out there. And that's what they did. They were called Bedouins or nomads, or in their language, Arabs, coming from Arabia. That's the only nation that Ishmael fathered. He was not the father of the Arab world. We must get that. He had 12 sons, and the text, you can read it later. He had 12 sons. You know what they were? They were chiefs of tribes living in tents. Chiefs of tribes living in tents. Now that describes a Bedouin. Chiefs of tribes, their tribal operation, the chiefs of the tribes living in tents. A Bedouin tent, you know what it's made out of? Goat hair. And they weave the goat hair together. You see the separation on my fingers there? That's the way it is normally, so the cool breezes can come into the Bedouin tent. But should it rain, then the goat hair's characteristic, it closes up to keep the rain from coming into the Bedouin tent. It's a transportable habitation. You take this goat hair Bedouin tent, and you fold it up, put it on your camel, and you go on down through the desert to try to find a greener pasture. You take some poles along with you. You stop to spend the night. You put the poles out. You put the Bedouin tent over it. And now you have an encampment. You know what would happen after Ishmael, the character that he brought to the scene? What was that character reference from Jesus? He'll raise his hand against every man's hand will be raised against him. And so he raised up a group of boys, 12 of them. And some of them were stronger than the weaker. And they were tribal leaders. And so the stronger tribal leaders decided to try to overthrow the weaker tribal leaders and incorporate his tribe into their tribe. They did that. And so that started to slow down the growth of the Arab, except for one major big Arab tribe out there. Some of them were strong enough to sustain their existence out there. Oh, by the way, do you know what they called that tribal leader who overran another tribe and brought it into his tribe? An Islamic warrior. Did you get it? And that was before Islam ever came on the scene. Islam didn't come on the scene till about 1,400 years ago. I'm talking about 4,000 years ago, when Ishmael went to Arabia and had 12 sons and raised them. And they went out overthrowing the weaker tribes. Islamic warrior, because you know that's an Arabic word. You know what Islam means? It doesn't mean peace, that is salam. Islam means submission. And so when the stronger tribal leader took charge of the weaker tribal leader, he brought him under submission. He was an Islamic warrior. And of course, it's that culture that continued on through Ishmael and his 12 sons to come to what I'm going to discuss just for a few moments, the Islamic faith. I'm not going to do a lot on this. It's not going to be an exhaustive study. I have a 5-hour CD teaching on Islam, which would be, I think, very good for you to get a copy of. You need to understand Islam. We don't. One of the reasons I had on this man who was born there in Iran and escaped just before the revolution, Shahram Hadian, I had him on the broadcast, a nationwide broadcast today with me that I did across the entire nation of the United States. And I had him talking about all this background of Islam and what they are doing today. And it's key for our understanding since they are the major player. But let me give you a little bit of information. Next time you go to Israel, do you go to a Bedouin camp when you're out there, or at least stop by and look at it? If you get away from pastor and you're in that Bedouin camp, may I give you a warning? There's some things you do and some things you don't do at a Bedouin camp. Now, all of those tents are going to be facing the east. This Bedouin tent, this goat hair tent they put up, it faces the east because they want the warmth of the sun when it comes up in the morning. The desert can get really cold, almost down to freezing, and so the warmth of that sun warms up the tent, so it faces the east. And so let's say that this pulpit is a Bedouin tent. Let's say that's the east. I don't know direction. Let's say that's the east. And the Bedouin tent is facing that direction. If you're going to visit, you get away from pastor, I would suggest you stay with him. But if you get away from him, I would suggest you not do what I'm going to say don't do. I'm going to tell you don't do this if you're going to visit a Bedouin tent. Walk up from behind and go up to the front. Hey, how you guys doing? Because in about 30 seconds, you're going to be dead. You don't startle a Bedouin. They'll kill you on the spot. What you do, and here's the best advice I can give you. If you're approaching a Bedouin tent from the back, I want you to go this way. Ha-ha-choo! Let them hear that you're outside. And they'll come out of the tent and they'll say, oh, hello, stranger. Come on in. You see, the Bedouins are renowned for their hospitality in the Middle East. And when you go around, they're going to bring you a cup of the hottest, blackest, strongest coffee you've ever had in your life. In fact, the coffee can walk from the fireplace over to you. It's so strong. It is unbelievable. Now, when you get that cup of coffee, nonchalantly look down at it. Don't let them know what you're doing, but just kind of glance. If that coffee cup is absolutely filled to the brim, you better start praying and confessing your sins. Because if they give you a full cup of black, hot, strong coffee, you've got about a minute to live. When you finish that coffee, you're going to be a dead person. But if you look down and that coffee cup is only half full, well, you can start singing the Hallelujah chorus, because you're going to be able to be their guest as long as they would want you to be there, or as long as you want to be there. After that, they give you a cup of the hottest, sweetest tea that you've ever tasted in your life. It's an interesting experience, but remember, if you get a whole cup of coffee, not too long before you're going to be out of this world into the heavenlies. You get that culture? I just gave that illustration to give you a little taste of the culture. That culture that came up from Ishmael and his descendants arrived in the 5th century, 6th century, 7th century in Arabia. And a man named Muhammad established a new religiosity. He said he was the prophet, the sole prophet for the God called Allah. Now let me give you a little bit. I'm not going to give an exhaustive study. I got 5 hours of study. You can pick it up and study yourself. But you need to be studying. If you use my material or use somebody's material, you need to understand it. Let me tell you a couple of things. First of all, the God of Islam is called Allah. Now I know the word Allah, A-L-L-A-H, is the word in Arabic for God, but that's a small g God. They claim he's the big G God. But I want to tell you a couple of things. He's not the God of my Bible, so don't get that confused. Allah of the Arabic Muslim world is not the God of the Bible. And here's why I say that. First of all, Allah never had a son. My Bible says, 1 John chapter 2, chapter 4, if somebody says that Jesus Christ was not the Son of God in the living flesh, they're an antichrist. Now, how plain is that? In other words, Islam is a satanic religiosity. It's satanic. There is no such thing as a moderate Muslim, because what Allah then did, he gave the Archangel Gabriel an order to go over to Muhammad and give him the Quran, which is their holy book. Their holy book. They have a saying over in Louisiana. I don't know if you've ever come through Cajun country down there, but here's the saying. Allah and also Muhammad said that the holy book, the Quran, came from the angel Gabriel. In Louisiana, they would say it like this: I guarantee that it was not the angel Gabriel. It was another false prophet or spirit, but it wasn't the angel Gabriel. And that Quran is the holy book. The Hadith, which should be an additional, almost equivalent to the Quran, holy book, would be the sayings and the activities of Muhammad. And so that brings about now Ramadan. We're in the month of Ramadan. It's the 9th month of the lunar year. They go by the lunar calendar. It's 30 days in a month, like the Jewish people do, instead of the solar calendar. And the 9th month is the month of dedication. It's Ramadan, and every single one of them will fast for the 30 days of Ramadan, because they believe what Allah said to them about all the activities of a Muslim world. In fact, when sun comes up in the morning, they get up, they don't eat anything, they don't eat, they don't smoke, they don't drink liquor, they don't do anything, sexual activities or anything else until sundown that night. And then they fast for a couple of hours, then go to bed and get up the next day for 30 days. You know what they're doing by saying that? They're saying, their God, Allah, Allah's word is absolute, we should abide by it. Do you know Allah calls for Islamic jihad? You know what that is? Holy war to the death. All Muslims are to be killed. And let me say this. I said a moment ago, there's no such thing as a moderate Muslim. You know what truly the Quran teaches? If a person is not a full-fledged, full-blown Muslim and abiding by everything the Quran says, they are hypocrites. And you know what the Quran says? That the Muslims can kill hypocrites. Boy, we could get rid of some hypocrites in our churches today if we took that. No, we're not going to do that, so just relax. But that's what the Quran is talking about. Their holy book, Islamic Jihad. This is what we need to understand. So I've talked about Ishmael, Islam. Now let's go to the invasion. What this is going to motivate to have happen. Go to the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 38. This is a passage along with Psalm 83 and Daniel chapter 11 that helps us to recognize what is going to happen as a basis from the Islamic world when they endeavor to follow through with the character of their founder, Ishmael, and endeavor to try to wipe out the Jewish state. Now, there's so much more about Islam. Mecca is the capital of the Islamic world. They have an eschatology. They believe in an end time. The time is running out, and I know you want that root beer float, so I've got to get out of here as quickly as we possibly can to get that. I mean, priority is priority, right? All right, chapter 38 of the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38. This is going to be a prophecy written 2,500 years ago by the prophet Ezekiel, Psalm 83 written about that same time by the psalmist, and Daniel chapter 11 written by the prophet Daniel about 2,500 years ago. And you put these three passages together to come up with what is going to be the end time scenario. Starting in verse 2, notice what the prophecy of Ezekiel says. Son of man, set thy face against Gog in the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Verse 6. And Gomer and all of his bands, and the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all the bands, and many people with thee. Now, I've just started to read some of the list of the nations that are going to join a coalition to form an alliance to come against the Jewish state of Israel. I mentioned Magog, I mentioned Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah. Keep your finger here in Ezekiel 38 because we're coming back. But let's go back to see how these nations were established. Chapter 10. That's where we were, book of Genesis. Let's go back over there and notice what it says. Chapter 10 and verse 1. We looked at verses 6 and following. Look at verse 1. Now these are the generations of the son of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And unto them were sons born after the flood. Now notice who these boys were that were born to Japheth. They would be grandsons of Noah. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, skip a couple, Tubal, Meshech, look at the last one in verse 3, Togarmah. Hello, have you heard those names before? They're over there in Ezekiel chapter 38. Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, Magog. These were all sons of Japheth, grandsons of Noah, 4,500 years ago. And look what it says here in verse 5. Chapter 10 of Genesis. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided into their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. This is the establishment of nations from the sons of Japheth, grandsons of Noah, and where they went to establish a nation. They were following the directive. What did God tell Noah? Genesis 9:1, I read it to you. Be fruitful, multiply, and repeople the earth. This is a direct command from God for them to do it. So they go forth to establish nations. Now, in order to know where these people went, you have to do some research, biblical, geographical, historical research. And I've done that, and I'm not a scholar in this area, but I went to the guys who are scholars. I know how to find their research material. And you know what I understand? I understand that these nations would be some nations that are familiar to us. Magog, you know where he went? North of the Caspian and Black Sea. You know what that piece of geography is called today? Russia. Magog went up there. Oh, you know what it included? The Ukraine. That was a part of the land that when Magog went up there, he established as a nation. The Ukraine. And there was Russia. In fact, the Ukraine, if you study about it, that was the fatherland for Russia. The king of the Ukraine sent his son, the heir apparent, he went over to St. Petersburg and established the ultimately modern-day nation of Russia. The Ukraine. There's an interesting connection there, isn't it? 2014, Vladimir Putin, who was, well, I'm going to have to tell you, I believe he's the richest man in the world. I believe he's a very smart brilliant statistician as well. 2014 in the summer, what were they doing? They were having the Olympics in Russia. And then after the Olympics is over, that great final activity, the fireworks they had, he woke up the next morning, told his generals, I want you to go over to the Ukraine, and I want you to go to that peninsula, which is jetting into the Black Sea from the Ukraine. It's called Crimea, and I want you to take that piece of real estate because we need a warm water port for my naval operations, both commercial and militarily. You see, up in the north, it's all ice up there most of the year. He needed a warm water port, so he's taking this peninsula off the Ukraine in the Black Sea called Crimea. And I said he was the richest man. You know, he paid for the Olympics. Russia couldn't take care of it. You know what Vladimir Putin is worth? The highest estimate, the least estimate, it's 140 billion with a B, $140 billion. The highest estimate is $171 billion. That makes old Bill Gates at 52 billion look like a piker, doesn't it? And you say, well, where did you get that from, Dr. DeYoung? Where do you think I got it? I Googled it. And I Googled it before you could, so I knew that I was right in telling you what I'm telling you. CNN did an interview with the biographer of Vladimir Putin. And CNN confirmed he's worth at least 140 billion, possibly 171 billion dollars. And with that kind of money, he could do what he needed to do. And so he took Crimea. You know what they're doing right now? They're trying to take the coastal cities of the Ukraine back so they have a land bridge from Russia over to their warm water port. Now, you got to admit that's a brilliant move that Putin is making. And I want to tell you something. There was only lip service when they took Crimea. When they took it, nobody really got upset about it. And so he was swift at the exact time he should have. After that great PR move there with the Olympics, he takes over Crimea. But Mr. Great Statistician was not too smart, because you know what he found out? He found out that the Black Sea was landlocked. Now he's got this warm water port, and there's no way he would get out of the Black Sea, except one way. You know what that way is? The Bosphorus River, coming down through Turkey. Judy and I were just in Turkey. I was doing some television there. We stayed in a hotel on the Bosphorus River. And at other times when I was there, we saw Russian submarines making their way through the Bosphorus River. It's a deep water canal coming through Turkey, coming down into the South Seas of Turkey, going ultimately into the Mediterranean, into all the waterways of the world. By the way, do you know what nations are represented by Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah? One nation, Turkey. Pick up any ancient Turkish map. In biblical times, in fact, the commentary from Dallas Theological Seminary has it in there, has a picture, has the locations in Turkey. You know, when it was Asia Minor, it was divided into 4 parts. You know what the 4 parts are? Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah. Isn't God pretty sharp? He figures it all out. Old dumb Putin will put him a warm water port in Crimea, but I'll give him a way to escape. I'll give him that Bosphorus River through Turkey. You see how all of these nations coming together to form a coalition to do what God knows and told the prophets to tell them. Go back over to Ezekiel chapter 38. Ezekiel chapter 38. I got 10 minutes before we have our root beer floats. And let me see if I can finish this. Go here to verse 5. Persia. Persia. You know who Persia is? Elam, one of the sons of Shem, who later was known as Persia, the Medo-Persian Empire. Do you remember the leader of the Medo-Persian Empire, Cyrus, who was prophesied 150 years before the fact, Isaiah 44 and 45, that in Ezra chapter 1, Cyrus would allow the Jews to go back to Israel and to rebuild their temple? Well, he was a Persian. He was a good Persian. In fact, he helped pay for the reconstruction of that temple. Persia today, you know who that is? Iran. Until 1936, they were known as Persia. Today, Iran still speaks the Persian language, but it was divided into 4 countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. Look up here in verse 5 again. Ethiopia, that's Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, the same as Cush in chapter 10. Libya, that's the same as Put in modern day language. Look, if you go back over to Psalm 83, just jot this note down. I'll not take you back over there. Psalm 83 talks about two additional nations that are listed. Psalm 83 replicates Ezekiel 38 and Daniel chapter 11. Psalm 83 talks about the psalmist beseeching God to take care of the enemies of the Jewish people. He says they're going to go into a council meeting. Verse 4 says they're going to come out and they're going to say, may we wipe Israel off the face of the earth, that her name be forgotten forever. That's what they're planning to do. In verse 6, it talks about the Ishmaelites. Where did Ishmael go? Saudi Arabia, an Ishmaelite. And then in verse 7, it talks about Tyre and Sidon, modern day Lebanon. When you go to Daniel chapter 11 in verses 40 and following, it talks about the king of the north and the king of the south. Early on in chapter 11, starting in verse 5, it describes the king of the north and the king of the south, where they are geographically. Again, I'm cutting short some of this study because, we've got things to do. But let me just say, the king of the north, according to Daniel chapter 11, is Syria, and the king of the south is modern day Egypt. When you look at the text in Daniel chapter 11, it says the first nation to make a move against the Jewish state of Israel, of all these nations, they're going to form an alliance, a coalition to try to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. The first nation to make a move is Syria. And I stand here in this pulpit to tell you right now, the Israeli Defense Force is massed in the Golan Heights at the border with Syria. And across the border in the Golan Heights over in Syria, they have Islamic Jihad, they have Islamic State, they have Al-Qaeda, they have Hezbollah, they have all the rogue forces that are trying to overthrow Bashar Assad, plus the Syrian military. You know what Bashar Assad has been saying, do you not? If you pay attention to the news, Bashar Assad said, I'm going to take back the Golan Heights. If I have to do it diplomatically, I'll do it. If I have to do it militarily, I'll do it. And you know what he said the other day? He's fighting for his life in the leadership of Syria. And here's what he said. I don't care what the situation is. In fact, if you destroy Damascus, I'm still going to win. Do you understand what he just said? That's Isaiah 17. Damascus will be destroyed. At the time in history, when are we talking about, dear friend? We're talking about within the first 6 months of the tribulation period. This coalition of nations is going to come together and they're going to try to wipe out the Jewish state of Israel. How do I know that? One more time, Ezekiel 38, and with this we'll close. Ezekiel 38, let me show you just 2 verses. Ezekiel 38. Look at verse 8. After many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations. By the way, who does that sound like? My dear friend, that surely does sound like the Jewish people coming into the land of their forefathers. That's Ezekiel. That is what's going on. It's an amazing thing that is happening here. Okay, now look what the last part of that verse says. And they shall dwell safely, all of them. Is Israel now in the land of their forefathers dwelling safely? Answer, no. Go up here to verse 11. This is a military terminology. When Ezekiel was writing this 2,500 years ago, he didn't know anything about an F-16 fighter jet, a Mark V tank, the most sophisticated tank in the world, an Apache attack helicopter. All he knew was that in order to defend a city of the Jewish people, they would put a wall around it. Now notice, and thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go up to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, and neither having bars nor gates. A military terminology, when Israel has laid down their defenses and are dwelling safely in the land, that's when this coalition of nations we've been talking about tonight comes in to try to wipe them out. How does that happen? Well, do you know what happens after the rapture? The revived Roman Empire comes into existence. Once that's happened, the little horn, the Antichrist, comes on the scene. Daniel 9:27 says he, the Antichrist, will confirm a covenant, a peace treaty. Didn't say he's going to sign a peace treaty. That starts the clock ticking on the 7-year period of time when he confirms. That word in Hebrew is gabar, G-A-B-A-R, which simply means confirm, which is what the King James says, not sign a peace treaty. And so the clock starts ticking on the 7 years once he's confirmed that peace treaty. But wait a minute, if he's not going to sign one, that would seem to indicate their peace treaty's already on the table. That's true. There are 3 of them. Camp David Accords, 1979, Israel and Egypt. They signed a peace treaty. Oslo Accords, September the 13th, 1993, at the White House in Washington, D.C. Yasser Arafat and then the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, signed a peace treaty. Oh, wait a minute. The next year, 1994, in October of that year, Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty. I was at that peace treaty signing. I was there for the purpose of, as a journalist, reporting what was taking place. It was a historic event. In fact, let me show you that peace treaty. I happen to have a copy of it right here. Notice what it says. The Treaty of Peace between the State of Israel and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, 26 October 1994. I want you to know something, folks. This was the largest gathering of journalists that I've ever seen in my life. There were over 1,000 journalists at this peace treaty signing. All the great journalists, maybe you remember some of them, they've already passed from the scene. Peter Jennings of ABC, Tom Brokaw of NBC, Dan Rather of CBS, Jimmy DeYoung, all the great journalists were there. Just want to see if they're still awake, Pastor. All of them were there, and they signed this peace treaty. I could go for about 2 more hours on this. I'm not going to do it. And that peace treaty's on the table. And that peace treaty's not working. In fact, King Abdullah, the son of King Hussein, who signed the peace treaty, said the other day, "We made a major mistake when my daddy made peace with Israel." They're trying to negate it. Egypt saying the same thing. Hello, do I have to tell you about the Palestinians who are ignoring the peace treaty? There it is. Wait a minute. I believe that the peace treaty that will be confirmed, according to Daniel 9:27, is this peace treaty, along with the Camp David Accords, along with the Oslo Accords. They're on the table, it's not working. The Antichrist will come and say, I can confirm that treaty. So I would suggest this is the treaty that would be confirmed. And do you know what they're talking about in Israel today? They're talking about a Saudi Arabian peace initiative. Now, I don't have time to go into that, but it is bad. And our president and our Secretary of State and the European Union and the United Nations all are pushing that treaty. Whether it's this or not, there's going to be a treaty to start all the tribulation period. We're here at that time in history. Do you know why it's going to happen? Because Islam has to be wiped out. Why? Well, what is the Antichrist going to be doing? In association with the peace treaty, he's going to be over in Rome putting together a false religion. And Islam will not coexist. You're a Muslim or you're a dead person. It's your choice. That is why Islam has to be wiped out in the first 6 months of the tribulation period, so God's program can be fulfilled. 9/11, beginning of the end. We come up to the time of the rapture of the church, the coalition of nations in the Middle East. Did you hear what I said, the coalition of nations in the Middle East? You know who is in Syria right now? Russia. Military bases, Air Force bases, naval ports. Iran. Saudi Arabia just did a military exercise with 25 Middle Eastern nations, 350,000 soldiers. They're getting ready to invade Syria. And that'll all put them all at Israel's northern border. That's what they're going to do. So we're right here before the rapture. We leave here. They confirm the peace treaty. And these nations attack. And in chapter 38, verse 18 to 39, 6, Islamic world is wiped out totally, so God's plan can go on. That's the scriptures. That's where we are. The stage is set. Every actor in place. Curtain about to go up on this end time scenario. Next thing to happen, the rapture. And we go in to be with him in the heavenlies. Father,